to, I suppose, throughout, American history. So a lot of my work on this particular topic has been mostly focused on the United States, which is where you can probably tell from my accent where I'm from. But the way, I wrote a book called One Nation Under Blackmail that sort of looks at these origins, and sort of where I pinpointed it sort of goes back, I guess, to the 20s and the 30s. More or less where this particular group, which called themselves the National Crime Syndicate, this mix of organized crime factions sort of came together. And then during World War II, they formed an alliance with U.S. military intelligence, the Office of Naval Intelligence. And then in the years after World War II, that alliance deepened, including with the creation of the CIA. And that's why you have so much overlap. For example, with early CIA hitmen and people involved in CIA assassinations being members of the mob as well. And that particular national crime syndicate was essentially a meeting of the Italian mafia and the Jewish mob being led by Mayor Lansky, and the Italian mafia being led by Lucky or Charles Luciano. And the two of them were childhood friends. And so previous to their team up, organized crime in the United States was sort of an ethnic silo. So you would have Irish organized crime, Italian organized crime, and so on and so on. It was sort of in these divided by ethnicity. And these two figures, because of their childhood friendship, sort of came together and sort of broke that pattern. They created an organization that became rather infamous called Murder, Inc. And essentially, through their fusion with with intelligence, became increasingly powerful. And it sort of they became sort of symbiotic, I've argued. And but really, one of the ways they were able to do that first is they took over the Democratic Party initially, and I definitely argue that they took over both parties relatively quickly. But the way they did so with the Democratic Party, the base of the Democratic Party historically were unions. And so they took over the leadership of the unions and took over the leadership of who counted the votes and all of this very early on in the 20s and the 30s. And, through that, were able to get their candidates through. And there were a few instances where, they threatened, key people's lives in this sort of political hierarchy in New York State. And then through that, were able to sort of, move on to dominate the country. And that definitely became very extensive with their team up with intelligence. And it's important to keep in mind that the people that essentially created the CIA and early American intelligence were pretty much all Wall Street bankers and lawyers. People may know about that in the case of, rather infamous CIA directors like Alan Dulles being from the Wall Street law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. But the leader of the OSS, which is sort of the precursor to the CIA, Bill Donovan, was also deeply tied to Wall Street. And even former CIA deputy directors from just 20 years ago have essentially said the CIA has always sort of been bankers. And so, bankers and organized crime, a lot of them are interested in, wealth and ultimately rackets. So if you think of organized crime sort of as its own entity and sort of take away all the associations we have with it because of Hollywood and all of these other narratives, essentially what it exists to do is expand the rackets that are lucrative and perpetuate them infinitely. Because if the racket is discovered or the organized crime syndicate is broken up, the flow of money stops. And so a lot of these lucrative rackets is later, intelligence later became very involved in them. These include things like arms trafficking and drug trafficking. These used to be the rackets of the mob, but by teaming up with intelligence, they were able to expand them and dominate them. And as a result, a lot of the Wall Street banks have become sort of dependent on money laundering. The income they make from money laundering from all of these illegal rackets has become, really critical to their operations. And people like Catherine Austin Fitts have argued that if, the drug trade were actually to be stopped in any meaningful way, we'd see a collapse of some of the biggest banks in the world. Which is why you have, banks like HSBC, for example, getting caught money laundering for some of the biggest and most criminal Mexican drug cartels. And then people like Mark Carney stepping in to try and smooth things over. Of course, he's a former governor of the Bank of England and Bank of Canada and is slated to follow Justin Trudeau, allegedly.